The Time Swindler. By Eileen Sheehan. Copyright 2023 Eileen Sheehan. Printed in the United States of America. Worldwide electronic and digital rights. Worldwide print rights. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, scanned, or distributed in any form, including digital and electronic or mechanical, including photocopying, recording, or by any information storage and retrieval system, without the prior written consent of the publisher, except for brief excerpts for use in reviews. This book is a work of fiction. Characters, names, places, and incidents either are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously, and any resemblance to any actual persons, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental. Notice: portions of this story may prove too graphic, sexually explicit, or violent for sensitive readers. This novel is intended for the mature adult. Prologue. A message on Facebook Messenger. Dear Cousin Josette. My name is Gretchen Fielding. I am your second cousin on your father's side. My sister, Maud, and I reside in our family home that is located in the Hudson Valley, New York. It is a long story as to how you came to our attention, so let's just bypass that part for now. I will be happy to share it with you at a later date and, hopefully, in person. The fact remains that we have recently learned of you and of the untimely death of your parents. We too have lost our parents. There are not many of our family residing on this side of the pond. Both Maud and I believed that we were the last of the Albert Fielding clan to be found on American soil. With us here on the East Coast and you an only child in the Midwest, we feel strongly that those of us who are of Albert's bloodline should stick together. It is a sad thing that we never knew of each other, but we know now, and that is all that matters. We wish to not only offer our heartfelt condolences for your loss, but we would be both honored and grateful if you would come for a visit with us in our home. It is a large and lovely house that has ample room for all of us. Not only is it large, but I am certain that you will find its historical architecture to be a delight to the eye. As for the area, we enjoy the ambience of the country on the edge of a quaint and small community with the convenience of having the great city of New York just a short train ride away. I understand that we are very close in age. I imagine we will have a lot in common and there is so much to do. Please consider our offer in earnest and, if nothing else, at least come for an extended visit so that we can get to know each other. Who knows, you might just like us and are home enough to want to stay. You can check me out on my Facebook page. Once I have received your reply to this message, I will happily provide you with an address and a phone number. Please feel free to telephone me whenever you wish or simply come. It is an open invitation and you are always welcome. With affection and sincerity, Gretchen. Chapter 1. Josie sat at the small two-seater table in the corner of the local coffee shop and sipped a cappuccino while enduring the overly emphasized scowl on her best friend, Diane's, face. Fairly unattractive to begin with, Diane's face was both round and padded with excess fullness that she insisted was a family trait and not due to the equally excess weight that her body displayed. With her rounded face so pinched with disapproval and bulbous nose with its flared nostrils that were a family trait, but more exaggerated when she was excited or upset, Josie couldn't help thinking about how closely her plump friend actually did resemble the Miss Piggy character that the cruel kids would constantly label her throughout their school years. You don't mean to tell me that you're actually going there, Diane snipped. I was thinking about it, Josie hesitantly replied. I hope that you at least hired someone to check them out, Diane snarled. I looked Gretchen up on Facebook and Instagram, Josie meekly offered. She seems legit. You need more than that if you plan on staying under the same roof as them, Diane vehemently insisted. Mom wasn't very good about tending to the household expenditures. She was so far behind on things that I was met with a pile of disconnect and late notices. I spent most of my savings catching them up, Josie admitted. I have no money to pay someone for something like that. Ouch, Diane said with a wince. On top of your college expenses, that had to have put a healthy dent in the old bank account. I don't have much left, Josie confessed with a slight nod that caused the tight curls that framed her oval face to bob just a bit. I'll have to take the rest of the year off and get a job to rebuild. I hate hearing that, Diane said. Her remark was accompanied by a scowl that was so intense that her eyes almost disappeared beneath her brows and cheeks. Her tone softened and held a hint of empathy as she continued with, if it's that bad, how did you plan on getting yourself to these mysterious cousins in New York? There's a small insurance settlement coming my way in a few weeks, Josie replied with a shrug. And they're not mysterious, just long lost. Then, wait the few weeks for the settlement and hire someone, Diane insisted. Gretchen said that they lived in a large house, Josie thoughtfully said with a hint of awe. I saw photos of it on her Facebook page. It's a damned mansion. Dad always said that we were the poor relations, but I never realized just how poor we were in comparison. I never considered your family to be poor, and I love your little bungalow, Diane protested as she looked out through the dirty pane of glass at a street that was just coming alive with movement. It's cozy and welcoming. It may be grand and posh, but I can't imagine how cozy a huge-ass mansion would be. I'd like to find out, Josie firmly stated. Her eyes followed her friend's. The activity outside of the coffee shop indicated that it was time for them to part company. I just don't understand why my mother never connected with them after Dad died. I didn't even know that we had family here. I thought they were all overseas. Gretchen seems so eager to connect. I imagine our lives would have been a lot easier had we known each other. Mom never even made mention of them. Besides Dad's occasional comments about us being the underdogs of the family and that it was good that we weren't associated, nothing was ever mentioned. The term underdog should clue you in, Diane offered. Something had to have happened to make him say that. After seeing photos of the way they live, I'm guessing that he was comparing his financial success to theirs, Josie said. I'm guessing that he didn't keep contact out of embarrassment. That's so wrong to do, Diane pouted. It shouldn't be about money. Money is just a thing. It's a happy home that counts. I agree. I'm not intimidated by their money, nor am I ashamed about the fact that I have very little of it, which is why I'm going to go meet them. After a small moment of silence and a sip of her coffee, she added, it's just that I think that if we had a bit of their money our home would have been a lot happier. Josie sighed, especially once Dad died. Mom really struggled to hold it together. In the end, she couldn't. She was sick, her best friend offered. She kept that from me until the very end, Josie complained with a hint of resentment. It seems everyone knew but me. Someone should have told me. She didn't want you leaving college to tend to her, Diane insisted. I wanted to tell you, but she swore me to secrecy. Josie looked down at her cup of brew that was finally at a drinkable temperature. She could understand, to some degree, Diane's reasoning, but they were supposed to be best friends. Therefore, she couldn't help thinking that Diane's loyalty should have been to her and not her mother. Diane's face lit up as she eagerly suggested, I could come with you. There's safety in numbers. Josie took a few seconds to actually give Diane's suggestion some thought. Since early grade school, the two women were practically inseparable, right up until Josie was accepted into college. Normally quick to accomplish tasks, Diane surprised Josie by procrastinating with her application while she labored over what she wanted to study. Josie had a passion for animals that steered her toward veterinarian school. Diane had merely a tolerance for the beasts, but was reluctant to separate from her friend. By the time she'd decided to suffer through veterinarian training and submitted her application, admissions had closed. Josie found their separation traumatic at first, but it eventually became liberating. It wasn't until she was forced to make life decisions on her own that she realized just how dependent and even controlled by her friend she'd allowed herself to become over the years. This trip to meet her long-lost relatives was an adventure that belonged to her. She had no desire to let Diane's powerful personality step in and take over. In truth, if she was going to take anyone with her, it would be her boyfriend and roommate, Leon. They had a strong bond between them. Even so, she was leaving him home as well. Slowly shaking her head, Josie said in as kind a voice as she could muster, "As much as I'd like that, I don't think it's polite to show up with a friend. Maybe, once I'm there and we get to know each other, I can see if you can come for a visit, but not right away." Looking a bit dejected, Diane muttered, "I suppose that makes sense." Then, heaving a sigh, she stood up and announced, "I have to get to work." Feeling a bit daring and mildly giddy over the new adventure that she was about to begin, Josie replied with, "I have to pack." "So soon?" Diane scowled. "You have a few weeks yet." "True," Josie mused. "I guess I'd be jumping the gun a bit if I did it now. It's just that it's such an adventure, I'm a little overly excited." "How does Leon feel about it?" Diane asked as she rummaged through the contents of her oversized canvas tote bag for what seemed to Josie like a ridiculous amount of time and pulled out her wallet. "He wants to come too," Josie admitted. Diane's brows lifted. "You said no to him too," she observed while opening her wallet with great care and selecting the correct payment for their coffees. "I told him the same thing I told you," Josie replied. "I'd love to have my two favorite people come and explore that mansion with me, but I need to feel these cousins out first. I don't want to piss them off right from the start by showing up with uninvited people." When Diane extended her hand that held the payment for their coffees toward her, she firmly declared, "It's my turn to buy." Throwing her hands in the air, Josie refused the money. Her tight, shoulder-length raven curls bounced about as she shook her head. "It's my turn and you know it." Shaking the well-worn green bills at her friend with a fervor that Josie was sure would bring undue and unwanted attention to them if it went on too long, Diane said in a none-too-soft voice, "Let me. You need your money for your trip." Seeing that what she'd feared would happen was happening, Josie boldly returned the looks from a few neighboring tables with an expression that she hoped said, "Mind your own business," while she snatched the bills from her friend's outstretched hand. "I hate it when you do that," Josie grumbled as she watched Diane drop her wallet into the bag's abyss. With a satisfied smirk, Diane turned on her heels and smugly said, "I know." Chapter 2. Leon stretched against the back of the 50s-style sofa as he propped his bare feet onto the small space that was left to accommodate them on the oak, rectangle coffee table that was laden with school books and plates from the meal that he and Josie had just finished. "I'm going to hate it when I have to cook my own food," he said as he rubbed at the flesh of his lean, muscled, and very bare stomach. "Is that all you're going to miss?" Josie asked as she picked the dinner plates up and headed for the kitchen. "I'll miss fucking you, too," he teased. She grinned and walked with an exaggerated swing of her hips into the kitchen to deposit the dirty dishes in the sink. Popping her head back into the living room, she jovially said, "I cooked, you clean up." "House rules." Sitting forward, he removed his feet from the coffee table and placed them flat on the floor. Rotating his shoulders and neck, he slid his hand down the inside of the front of his jeans, cupped his manhood, and firmly stated, "I want dessert first." Giggling, she skipped back into the room. He'd barely had enough time to pull his hand back out of his pants before she jumped onto his lap and straddled him. This was something that she did often, but he didn't mind. She was a slight girl of 5'3" and barely weighed 100 pounds, while he was 5'11" and on the college wrestling team. Having her fling herself on him was no more of a burden than having a towel tossed onto his lap. Or, so he claimed. She could feel his hardened manhood against her groin. Knowing that she had limited weight to aid her cause, she ground her hips against him with as much power as she could muster. "You're awful," she said with false indignation as she wrapped her slender arms around his powerful neck. "I'm in love," he whispered as she snuggled into him. "I love you, I love your body, and I really love your snatch." She pushed herself far enough away to look at him, laughed, and said, "My what?" "It's what Peter calls your love box," he explained. "I think I prefer love box," she softly cooed as she gently kissed his thick, muscled neck. "How did I get so lucky as to land the sexiest guy on campus?" "You landed me?" he jokingly asked as he pulled her t-shirt over her head and tossed it on the floor next to the sofa. With one hand, he deftly unfastened her bra, removed it, and dropped it next to her shirt. She relaxed her head and allowed it to fall back while she reveled in the sensation of his attention. Although slight of build, Josie's breasts were abnormally large for her body. They were so large that she almost looked top-heavy. The facts that her waist was small, her hips were narrow, and her buttocks was almost flat aided in emphasizing their size. Being a breast man, it was one of the factors that first attracted Leon to her. His hands cupped and kneaded their meatiness while holding her in place. Josie loved the feel of having her breasts attended to. As a result, she was prone to squirm with delight at the sensation. This sometimes made it so that Leon had to chase after them to maintain his mouth's grip. A low groan escaped him as she ground her hips even harder against him. With her arms still wrapped around him and his mouth still attached to her pert, rosy nipple, he stood up and lowered her onto the sofa where he'd just been seated. Her generous breasts allowed him to move about to a certain extent while still vigorously suckling. As a result, he managed to remove her pants without interrupting the delight that they were both experiencing. Tossing the pants onto the floor next to her t-shirt, he released her nipple and, kneeling before her, moved his mouth to her womanhood. She positioned her legs loosely over his shoulder while his powerful tongue worked its magic. Within seconds, she was climaxing. She put her own hands to work massaging her breasts and teasing her nipples with her fingertips while she arched her back and tightened her legs over his shoulders as she enjoyed his tongue's expertise. It wasn't long before he'd brought her to such an erotic height that she questioned if she'd survive it. More than once, Josie experienced a twinge of guilt where Leon was concerned. She'd met him within her first month at veterinarian school. Delighted to discover that, not only was he sexy and handsome, but they had similar goals, she almost immediately fell into a monogamous relationship with him. Being faithful wasn't difficult for her, since it wasn't in her nature to jump from guy to guy. For Leon, on the other hand, it proved a bit more challenging as he had a thirst for sex that she sometimes found difficult to quench. She got genuine enjoyment from sex, but there was a limit to how many times a day she felt the need for it. He, on the other hand, wanted it several times a day, every day of the week. It was because of his honesty with this fact and her desire to keep him from wandering that she granted it to him whenever he expressed the need, even though, more often than not, she wasn't in the mood. It was their lack of compatibility when it came to the amount of sex one should have in one day that kept the barrier of love up where she was concerned. She was very attracted to Leon and in many ways loved him, but she knew in her heart of hearts she couldn't, nor did she want to keep the sexual pace that he demanded for an extended length of time. Her only hope was that she'd be able to last through their education process. She may not have loved him enough to want to spend the rest of her life with him, but she did have love for him and she didn't know how she'd react to seeing him on campus with a new girlfriend. Not only was he 1 year ahead of her, but the odds of them getting a position in the same location after they graduated were slim, which would provide that separation opportunity that she knew deep down inside of her she'd eventually seek. They made love so many times that night that she was actually sore enough to beg him to stop. Although Leon was a huge fan of sex and big on enjoying her body, his panic over them being separated for the few weeks that she planned on being away had caused him to become unreasonably needy. As they lay in their bed after what she hoped was their final session of intense lovemaking, he whispered, "I love you. We should think about getting married." Sitting up with a start, she turned to face him and said, "Where did that come from?" He gave a slight shrug. "I've had it on my mind for a while," he admitted. "I thought that we agreed to both finish school before even thinking about it," she said. "What happened to your theory of getting married under the age of 30 is foolish." "So, you don't want to marry me?" he pouted. "No. Yes. I mean, I haven't thought about it," she guiltily stammered. "The last we spoke of marriage was to veto it until we accomplished our goals and reached the age of 30. After a brief moment of silence, she asked, "Where is this coming from? Are you that worried about my going east?" "I'm afraid you'll like it so much that you won't come back," he muttered. Leaning over to look at his face in the darkness that was only slightly illuminated by the street lighting that trickled through the blinds, she softly said, "I love you, baby. Money and a mansion can't alter that. Besides, it's their money and their mansion. I'm just going for a visit." She didn't feel guilty about professing her love because she did love him. She just didn't love him enough to marry him. Hopefully it was just his panic over her leaving that put the idea of marriage into his head, and he'd abandon it as soon as she returned and things went back to normal. "They'll spoil you and you won't want to live in this shithole with me after that," he complained. She laid back onto the pillow. "It may be a shithole," she agreed, "but it's our shithole. Besides, I intend to ask them to let you come for a visit once I've met them and can feel them out to see if they'd go for it. You and Diane both. So, if they let you come, you'll have to come back to this shithole with me." She could feel his body noticeably relax. Her confession of hoping that he'd be able to join her at some point had calmed him considerably. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her long and hard. She had no guarantee that her cousins would be amiable enough to allow him to visit, but she put it out there for him anyway. This was their last time together for several weeks. That might not seem long to some couples, but for Leon, who demanded sex so often that one might consider him to be a sex addict, it was an eternity. She didn't want to marry him, but she didn't want him to look elsewhere either. Not yet, anyway. Her feelings were complicated at best. Whether she was right in suggesting he could come and visit or not, it was the only thing that she could say in good conscience to give him hope, and that was the right thing to do. Chapter 3. It was almost midnight before Josie pulled into the run-down and eerie-looking motel to book a room. She'd told herself that it looked so scary because of the hour. Not only was she not accustomed to traveling such a distance by car and alone, but on the few occasions when she did drive solo far enough away from home to require an overnight stay in a hotel or motel room, she selected one of the well-known chains and was safely snuggled in her room no later than 8 p.m. Sadly, due to her desire to bypass major construction on the route she'd originally selected, she'd referred to an alternate one on her GPS. She'd never trusted a GPS to be accurate, and her experience just then was the reason why. Her heart raced with apprehension as she sat behind the wheel and stared at the motel lobby door. She'd passed several more prosperous-looking establishments which she would have preferred, but their lobbies were closed for the night. She was afraid she'd have to pull over onto the roadside to sleep just a bit until she saw the sign for this motel. It was the first one she'd found that was still open for business. Since the parking lot had a good deal of cars in it, the crater-sized potholes, large patches of peeling paint on the exterior walls, and weathered window sashes and door frames surprised her. Surely they could afford to keep things up a bit better. The place looked so sketchy that she sat behind the wheel and debated whether she might be better off sleeping on the roadside. After all, it was a secondary road that she'd seen minimal traffic on. Of course, it would only take one car with one rapist or murderer in it. The motel had 2 stories. Just as she'd forced herself to get out of her vehicle with the intention of going into the lobby, a buxom and very naked female stepped out of one of the second-floor rooms and called out to a man who was pulling clothing out of the trunk of an older model Cadillac. Draping her oversized breasts over the railing, the naked woman bent over as far as she could and called out, "Get me my blue dress." Stunned to look up and find a set of bulbous boobs with large, pink nipples staring down at her, Josie rushed into the lobby. The door hadn't even closed behind her when she breathlessly announced, "I need a room." An elderly, balding, pot-bellied clerk in a dirty, well-worn t-shirt and tattered jeans stood behind the counter. Her nose wasn't normally sensitive to odors, but there was no missing the fact that he was long overdue for a bath. Pale gray eyes ogled her from behind thick, black-rimmed glasses that were precariously perched on his nose. He made no effort to take them off her large breasts as he asked with a weaselly eagerness that made her shudder. "Short or long stay?" "People stay long here," she said with surprise as she looked out of windows that were so dirty that she could barely make out what she was seeing. "The entire night," he replied. "I have a short day coming available in a few minutes." She wasn't sure why, but she found herself asking, if a long stay is the entire night, what's a short stay? He sucked at something that was stuck in teeth that were badly in need of brushing as he replied with, 3 hours. "They book the room for a fuck and then leave." When her eyes went wide, he added, "Don't worry. I'll give you clean sheets. The maid is off at night, but you can change them yourself if you want." Craning his neck to look past her to her car, he asked, "You alone?" If the fact that she'd realized what type of motel she'd stopped at wasn't enough to make her get back into her car, his last question was. Without hesitation she blurted out, "Never mind," before rushing out of the door and back to her car. The adrenaline that flowed through her veins as she thought about all that could have happened to her had she booked a room in that sleazy motel acted as a stimulant to push away the sleepiness that she'd felt upon entering the motel parking lot. Turning on the ignition, she added to the size of the potholes by kicking up the loose gravel with her tires as she tore away from that motel of ill repute. She chastised herself for not recognizing, at once, what type of place it was. She should have known, upon seeing that naked woman and hearing her demand her dress, that she was a prostitute. What would have happened to her had she booked a room? The way the clerk was eyeing her breasts, she wouldn't have put it past him to use a master key and sneak in while she was sleeping to rape her. Or, perhaps he'd take money from one of the guests for the use of the key and raping her. Or, maybe that motel was involved in human trafficking and she'd be lost to Leon and Diane forever. Both of them, on separate occasions, had emphasized their discomfort in her traveling for several days alone. It was like they worked with the same mind. Both brought up the fact that the World Wide Web had helped human trafficking rise to an all-time high in history and that a pretty young woman who was traveling alone, especially one who wasn't worldly and used to travel, would be a prime target. Perhaps they were right. Maybe she should have flown the few hours that it would have taken by plane and not driven. It was just that she didn't know about the car situation. She couldn't afford to rent a car for that length of time and she wouldn't think of asking them to rent one for her, if they were even that generous. Once she arrived, she wanted the freedom of mobility that having her own vehicle provided. After she'd gone a distance that made her feel safe again, she pulled her Volvo to the side of the road and quickly searched her GPS for the location of a more reputable motel. Seeing that there was a major highway about 30 minutes away, she relaxed and continued driving. Major highways always offered reputable motels with lobbies open throughout the night. Or so she hoped. To her dismay, she had to bypass several motels that had closed before she reached a Days Inn. By the time she reached the motel, the adrenaline she'd been depending upon to keep her going was waning and sleep was, once again, claiming her. Besides the fact that the motel parking lot was minus potholes, she was delighted to enter the lobby and find that it was clean. The middle-aged woman behind the counter was clean, well-dressed, and polite. All in all, it was a much more comforting experience. After forcing herself to stay upright long enough to book her room, she managed to have the presence of thought to ask where to go for breakfast. The clerk informed her that the lobby provided coffee, donuts, and cold cereal in the morning until 9 a.m. After that, there was a diner just a quarter-mile up the road that had decent food. Thanking the clerk, she made her way to her room through the brightly lit parking lot. Once inside, she locked the door and fell onto the bed, not taking the time to wash or change into pajamas. She'd worry about cleaning up in the morning. At that point, she was so tired, she could have been sleeping on sheets just used by a prostitute and wouldn't have cared. This has been an AI recording of the first few chapters of Eileen Sheehan's novel, The Time Swindler. It has been provided by the author to allow you a better opportunity to see if this story is for you. If you enjoyed this or one of her other chapter samples of novels that she has written, please like and subscribe. If you prefer a human voice audio recording, they are available through Amazon or iBooks. Thank you.